This week I'm joined by Peter Ludlow, who is a philosopher of language, whose research interests are related to cyberspace, cyber rights, and governance within virtual spaces. In this episode we talk about Crypto Anarchy, Cyberstates, and Pirate Utopias, a collection of essays on cyberspace edited by Peter. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my patrons for making this work possible, and if you'd like to support Hermitix podcast or become part of the Hermitix community, please find our Patreon, donation, merchandise and Discord links in the description below. Enjoy. So, Peter Ludlow, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So before we jump into the Hermitix question, just a little bit about you and your work and sort of what your interests are. I mean, primarily we'll be talking about the book text you edited, which has become sort of infamous, the Crypto Anarchy, Cyberstates, and Pirate Utopias, which was published in 2001. But I'm sure I know there's a lot more about your background with regards to semantics and other digital and cyber ongoing. So perhaps a brief overview of your work and what it is you do.
Yeah, that's true. I have a few different irons in the fire. One of them is on semantics of natural language, or the theory of meaning, with technical tools applied to that. Another is in the area of epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. Some applications of the nature of language to both epistemology and to metaphysics, and lots and lots of interest in topics related to cyber culture, cyber rights, and then that book that you referenced to, the Crypto Anarchy, Cyberstates, and Pirate Utopias. So
I'll start with the Hermitix question. You can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
Dude, I hate that question.
Really?
It's like it's so hard. It's not that it's not a fun question, but it's just so hard. I mean, how do you pick three out of thousands? But listen, there are actually a couple of people from let me just stick with the 20th century just to keep this easy for me. Mm-hmm. There are three people from the 20th century that I think had untimely ends. One of them, everyone will know, which is Alan Turing. And most people know about Alan Turing's work and, cracking the Enigma code and his theory of the Turing machine and using that to, precify the notion of computation and so forth. What people don't know is he was doing a lot of other interesting work, in particular with things like what we could call mathematical biology. So, for example, in his later days, he was doing some work on the mathematics of patterns of spots and stripes in animals, right? And so the kind of idea he had was that evolution is not just this tinker business, but that there was a physical and a mathematical channel, in fact, through which all of this had to proceed. And I find that interesting. I'd like to know more about that. My other two persons that I'd want in this are great interlocutors. They both had very untimely deaths. One is virtually unknown outside of analytic philosophy. It's a guy by the name of Frank Plumpton Ramsey. Have you ever? No. Okay. No. So, this guy is great. There's a new book that just came out about Ramsey. It's by Cheryl Misak, M-I-S-A-K. And Ramsey was in Cambridge at the time that Wittgenstein was. And he was busy interacting with, Russell and Keynes and Wittgenstein, and worked very closely with Wittgenstein on the Tractatus, and worked with him on the translation of the Tractatus. But the tragic thing is that Ramsey died when he was 26 years old. Mm-hmm. Now, the sort of interesting thing is he had all these papers that he had written that have become fundamental in certain branches of analytic philosophy. But more than that, he did some really fascinating work in economics. Like, this is when he was under the influence of Keynes, I think. And he wrote papers on taxation theory and also savings theory, like how a government, for example, should go about saving money. And some of those papers, like 50 years later, they became seminal papers in the field of economics. So he's like a really fascinating guy. And, he was the kind of guy that could go grind through something like the Tractatus line by line with Wittgenstein. And then the last one is another British philosopher that met with an untimely death, and his name was Gareth Evans. And he died in the 1980s. He was around, around 35 years old. I'm not sure, but he was roughly around that age. And he was very influential in my technical work, if not my esoteric work. And I would like to hear more from him, So I'm sure there are many, many people. No, I know there are many, many people who didn't get to say everything they needed to say. But these are just the three people closest to my work that I want to hear more from.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that between those three thinkers, there's would be some form of coherent idea which they would all probably begin to talk about?
I would guess yes. I would guess that they would be. I think Turing ends up being the center of this thing, and those two other guys would be, probing him and trying to get clarification of what he was up to and his different projects and so forth. But I think they're both very excellent. The kind of person in a conversation who's not just spinning out the ideas, but is very good at, someone like you, for example, who's good at drawing things out of people.
And with this idea of mathematical biology, has there been any continuation of this since Turing, or is it sort of a relatively esoteric and underground pursuit?
I think it has had uptake in various branches of biology, although it's dicey. Okay, it's a branch of biology that's somewhat controversial. I've seen if you Google it, you'll find some really interesting articles about it that are written for a general audience. And, people are applying it, extending it even to things like teeth in animals, the development of teeth in animals. And Noam Chomsky picked up the idea. He's been one of the big advocates of this idea, and I think he thinks that something like that is going on in formal linguistics. That is to say, language is controlled in part, or the evolution of language was in part controlled by the physical channel and also the mathematical channel.
Is there a way to explain that to the layman? Would I be incorrect in saying that means in some sense that our physical and mathematical developments would have effects on the direction of evolution?
Opposite, I think. I don't mean to say opposite, but I think it's not that it's our developments of mathematics that have an effect, but it's rather that there are certain mathematical principles that govern the universe, and how you get fractal patterns in nature, for example, right? We see so there's a certain kind of mathematical and physical principles that govern the emergence of these fractal patterns in things ranging from sunflowers and ferns to galaxies. Okay, and then the idea is, that's quite likely true for things like animals, spots and stripes too. Maybe things like teeth. Maybe things like human language.
Maybe this will come back up. Maybe not. Maybe these thinkers will come back up. Ramsey's certainly an intriguing one. Someone so young. So I've noted down the book. So I'm definitely going to check that out. But this question I didn't actually send to you. So apologies for this. So 2001 was when you wrote Crypto Anarchy, Cyberstates, Pirate Utopias, so 19 years ago now. So a couple of questions. How did it come about that you wrote, you edited it. How did it come about that you edited this work? And if you were to edit such a work now, what would be the difference in what you thought should be included?
Okay, I came to this. There was the Crypto Anarchy book is kind of a sequel, because in around 1996, in the very early days of the internet, I had a collection called High Noon on the Electronic Frontier. And then as I spent time in cyberspace after the publication of that, I began bumping up into these issues about governance over and over and over again. And the theme of crypto anarchy was in the original volume, but it kept recurring, and it was just I thought it would be time to revisit it around the end of the millennium. And so the actual my end of the work was completed. I think I actually finished it on January 1st, 2000, and then shipped it off to the publisher, and then it appeared a year later. Now, I forgot the second part of your question.
If you were to edit such a work,
I think I would not redo that volume, but push on to something else. Quite possibly. Well, actually, not even possibly. I'm actually developing the three-peat version of the book, which goes to issues of cryptocurrency and virtual corporations and so forth. So the working title of that one is In Satoshi We Trust. And it's about the extension of Bitcoin-like blockchain technologies to other human domains.
This is one of the questions I had here, so we can sort of bring this in as it's sort of now coming up. I mean, the understanding that I have, I'm relatively well versed in cryptocurrency. So Bitcoin is, can be taken as the currency. Some people have said that Ethereum is then taken and understood as laws and legislation and rules. And some have gone so far to say that Urbit can be understood as virtual property. And there's certainly a lot of other virtual reality cryptocurrency properties, currencies coming around. So is that what you mean by cryptocurrency extending into other domains?
Yeah, well, let's talk about Ethereum. And I don't yet think about Ethereum as governance, although I take your point. But here's our opportunity to bring Alan Turing back in, because the sort of genius idea behind Ethereum is that you can not only encode information about like a ledger, like who has how much money, but you could encode a computer program right there in the blockchain. And the way Vitalik Buterin designed Ethereum, the idea was that we could have a language that is Turing complete, so that any computer program you write, you could encode into the blockchain. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that you and I could write a contract and encode that contract in the blockchain. Like, say we have a bet about something. We don't need to go to a bookie. We don't need a third party to hold the money for us. It's just that there's some oracle that, say it's a bet over the election, whether Trump wins, right? So there's some oracle, let's say it's the New York Times. If they announce that Trump wins, then that program in the blockchain automatically delivers the money. And so the thought is that what that sort of technology can do is replace any institution of human trust. So not only banks. So if you think of Bitcoin as replacing banks to some extent.
Centralized banks.
Yeah, centralized banks. Yeah. So you could replace title companies. You could replace insurance companies. You could replace not even institutions of trust, but any sort of institution like a hedge fund, for example, right? If you could build an AI that could do, risk arbitrage or any form of arbitrage, then you just automate the whole thing. And you don't need the giant buildings full of people in white collared shirts, pushing paper for you. All of that stuff can be automated. So I think of Ethereum as somewhat, I take your point about it's about governance too, because computer programs are the new governance structures for us in any case. And so that would continue to be more so the case. But there are also these really interesting issues about governance that come up with how the protocol for a cryptocurrency is going to change, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, these things all have to change over time, right? They're not actually immutable. And with something like Bitcoin, the people who currently call the shots are the miners. And if a change doesn't have uptake with the miners, that is, if they're not going to mine Bitcoin on that protocol, then it's not going to happen. But there are other protocols like proof of stake, where it's just, I hold X amount of this cryptocurrency. That means I have a certain say in the future of this stuff. And then where things get really interesting is with a cryptocurrency by the name of Tezos, Tezos, and they very, very literally, or very directly, I should say, address this idea about how governance should work, right? How it is that, and how the protocol should change. And so they're actually introduced voting mechanisms into this so that people can vote on the protocols of these cryptocurrencies. So the thing is, yes, we are being governed by these computer programs and by the result of the blockchain technology, but then who's governing those governors? And so the trick here, the interesting puzzle, is how to put us in charge of controlling the direction of the changes of those protocols in cryptocurrencies.
Mm-hmm. This is what I was going to say. Is the kind of clear alteration between the way in which this government works, form of governance works with regards to cryptocurrencies, and the way in which classical or normal modes of governance works, is that it's relatively easy for anyone to begin to create some form of governance with cryptocurrency, whereas the barrier to entry for normal mode of governance, to become an MP, to become a politician, is quite high. It's reliant on a lot of cultural, should we say, baggage, or a lot of networking, a lot of connections, whereas someone who's anonymous, such as Satoshi Nakamoto, can create this without any of that. So the difference is the means of governance is handed over to the individual who has the ability to create this currency.
Well, it's a new barrier, and I'm not even sure. It might be a higher barrier because I could not design my own cryptocurrency.
But you could if you spent the time to learn the architecture, right? Like, there's no entry barrier to go straight into it, other than like tech smarts and intelligence.
I mean, okay. So let's grant that anyone can can get as far in mathematics as they need to, and computer programming. Which, okay, let's just say that's true, so that all of us with a year of hard work could create our own cryptocurrency. Yeah. I mean, yeah, but then there's the question of, well, which currency is going to have uptake, you know? Mm-hmm. And just because you have a better mousetrap, it doesn't mean it's going to have uptake. And, you know, Bitcoin in some sense is the worst of the worst on many levels, with its proof of work thing. And it's, you know, it's slow, it's clunky, it's awful, but it has a certain kind of gravity to it. And like a social network, I mean, that's what makes the difference between winners and losers. So even though you could design a new cryptocurrency or some new blockchain technology, I think you have very little control over whether that just drops into the dustbins of history or not.
Mm-hmm. So why are these new modes of governance so important then?
Well, someone's going to be a winner. And they are going to change life. And I believe they really are going to. You know, this is the reason. You know, you remember the days of Tower Records, where we used to have to go to places like Tower Records in order to buy music. And this is going to do to the finance industry and lots of those industries of trust, lots of these white-collar industries. This is going to do to those white-collar industries what file sharing did to Tower Records. I mean, it is inevitable that those industries will be replaced because they're completely redundant and we don't need them. I mean, ultimately.
We don't need them in the form that they have. Do you think that many of those industries might bankrupt themselves in expensive pushback against this, as opposed to just accepting it and building the infrastructure they need to just go into it? Because it seems to me like so many banks, other than a few who are ahead of who are sort of just accepting this, you know, they sort of still deny cryptocurrency transactions, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, what they do is they take the technology and they're applying it internally. So Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase, I guess, he's like doing a lot of shit talking of cryptocurrency, but at the same time, he's applying developing blockchain technology within Chase itself. So their strategy, I think, is to absorb that technology and make the independent technologies, the non-corporate based ones or the truly distributed ones like Bitcoin, to make them unnecessary, to render them odious if possible. I mean, that's the gambit. And so will that be successful? You know, who knows? But I think that's their strategy.
I'm sure cryptocurrency will come back in. Maybe we'll even begin to form the idea of what a cyberstate can look like. But before we can do that, there's a lot of talk early on in this text of the notion of the social contract, the classical political notion of the social contract, and what happens to this notion when it comes into contact with cyberspace and the virtual. What happens to these notions of freedom and the acceptance that we are within a society when we have to abide to strict rules. Well, you were sort of there in a way, because one of the things which is unique about your work is that instead of being the third party who's just looking in, you were within these worlds. So I guess probably reframe the question: what happened to it while you were there? What happened to the social contract while you were within these domains?
Nothing good. I mean, here's the problem that, we talk about the social contract, but it's never actually written down normally. But you get into a virtual world, and the first thing you have to do is to click on a term of service agreement, as though this is our new social contract and this is the thing we all have to agree to in order to participate. And my sense is that a genuine social contract is not of that form at all, but it's going to be amorphous. The minute you put it into writing, it's dead. It has to be flexible. It has to be dynamic. We have to be able to adjust the contours of the social contract depending on the context, depending on the needs and desires of other people. And I think the problem with these virtual worlds, for the most part, is that the official social contracts of them, when they put them in writing, are counterproductive to all of that. Now, the good news is that people, for the most part, just ignore those the social contracts, as terms of service agreements, etc. I don't read them. Probably you don't read them. Probably you have, of all your readers, probably one or two actually read the things before they click on them. But on the other hand, I mean, those things are enforced. And it was in the Obama administration that the Attorney General decided that, violating the terms of service agreement of one of these computer companies was a felony, right? Mm-hmm. So every time you're violating the term of service agreement, weirdly, you are a felon. Now, one thing that means is that in the eyes of the United States government, pretty much every adult person in the country is a felon, because I find it hard to believe that people aren't accidentally stumbling all over the rules of these online agreements. Some of the things they had are pretty ridiculous, like in Match.com, it's part of the term of service agreement that you don't lie. Okay, well, do you want to tell me that nobody is like lying about their weight or their height or anything like that in Match.com? I'm not going to buy it. And I think at one point, 17 magazine made you certify that you were 18 years old in order to read it. Okay, so whoever is flouting those regulations is a felon in the eyes of the Justice Department of the United States. Let me just leave it there and let you follow up.
My follow up is one of the later questions where I was going to ask you about how cyber sovereignty is different to being sovereign in quotation marks the real world, but actually it changes the question, because within cyberspace you've made it clear we have these clear terms of service, or metaphorically a clear social contract which is actually written and striated and it's done, and you have this thing to react against. So it seems strange to me that anarchy is so prevalent online, or maybe is anarchy so prevalent online because in reaction to a clear social contract, personal anarchistic sovereignty seems clearer. Whereas if you're reacting against an amorphous social contract, it's much harder to find whether or not someone's breaking the rules.
That's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought of that. And for sure, there are a lot of people that are out there just playing a game against the game company or the virtual world company. And that was sort of a theme of a book that I wrote later, the one on the Second Life Herald. That is, part of the gameplay could be a game that you play against the company. And it is sort of weird. In when I was in Second Life for all those years, there were lots of weird groups roaming around, game playing as either anarchists or fascists or whatever. And at the same time, the United States government was in there. Various intelligence agencies were in there exploring it, trying to understand what's going on. I mean, this is not some sort of secret that the CIA was in there and the FBI was in there. And so all of these parties started, it was like they're wargaming against each other for a bit. It's very, very interesting. Now, to your question of where does this go, I think they were wargaming against each other and ignoring the official terms of service. And I've had people tell me, for example, Barrett Brown, who spent a bit of time in prison recently, related to his publishing of documents from a hack of the Stratfor Corporation. I mean, he told me that he got his chops, as it were. A lot of people learned how to do a certain kind of underground, nonlinear action against the state in this virtual world. So, well, the original question took us to the idea that there could be these emergence of anarchistic movements as a response to a very strict terms of service agreement.
Yeah.
And I think the answer to that is yes, in part. But I do think that this would have emerged even if there were no strict terms of agreement. And the evidence for that is when you get to some of these image boards like 4chan, there was basically no terms of service. It was a free-for-all. And a lot of the online anarchist stuff emerged from those environments as well. So I guess the answer is that I believe that the strict terms of service did have some effect on the trajectory of the emergence of these virtual online anarchist movements, but it's only part of the story. And I think there are multiple sources for what ultimately transpired and what I do believe has metastasized into the general culture.
So what is it about the virtual world, do you think, that allows people to really let themselves go and to enter into all these almost like emancipatory forms of politics, or ways of being that they just probably felt a bit too, would feel they would be too alienated if they performed it in, say, the material world? Yeah.
Well, there are multiple things. One is that there are certain physical obstacles to practicing these things, right? In an encounter with the police on the street, you're likely to get tased or tear gassed or arrested. In a virtual space, maybe they hunt you down, but probably not. And there are ways to protect yourself in a virtual space. So there is less danger in the virtual space, but I think there is also a certain kind of freedom in a virtual space that you don't get in the real world, in the sense that people tend to feel freer to express themselves, both how they present themselves. Like, I could present myself with any sort of avatar that I want, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I could dress as a robot or a furry or whatever it is. And even in the street, there are a kind of fashion code if you want to be protesting in the street. And so there are more channels to express yourself in an online environment, more opportunities to experiment, more opportunities to make mistakes. And thus, it ended up becoming a kind of petri dish for the formation of different strategies, which only later extended out into the streets. I mean, there's a really interesting question, like, are any of the events that we see in the streets of the United States right now, would they be happening, or would they be playing out in the same way had there not been these kinds of events inside of virtual worlds? And to what extent have those sort of practice anarchist movements in virtual worlds contributed to the current direction and the current texture of of the online protest movement. Sorry, the real, quote unquote, real world protest movements.
So you think this is what's going on at the moment, sort of hypothetically could be a real world projection of a previously enacted online fantasy?
Yeah, I would put fantasy in scare quotes because it's never just a fantasy. But yeah, it's more like wargaming, right? Which is not, it's kind of fantasy, but it's fantasy with application in the real world.
In what sense does it have application in the real world?
Well, if you're wargame, say you're with the military and you're wargaming, you're doing it with the idea that it's going to have application should there be a real world conflict. And even though I think in virtual worlds people weren't thinking in terms of, geez, I'm going to need this one day, they did educate themselves in certain kinds of subversive strategies. And now we see some of those subversive strategies and methods being deployed in the real world. Sorry, quote, real world.
Well, yeah, this is the big question, which is, I mean, people are coming around a lot more to the idea of cyberspace being real. But it used to be, at least when I was younger, that there was a very clear split. What was on your screen, what was on your computer screen, what was on your TV, unless it was explicitly made clear that it was reality TV or, reality something or other. It was fantasy, it was fake, it wasn't real. That was usually the way it was said. So what do you think it is? Why do you think it is that people find the idea of cyberspace being real or actually being reality an abhorrent idea?
Yeah, well, they just didn't think it through very well. So, look, you and I are having this conversation right now, okay? Mm-hmm. But it is being mediated digitally, okay? Mm-hmm. So I'm not looking at you face to face. I'm not, or only through the miracle of Skype, mm-hmm. right? So that's computer mediated communication, and all of your listeners are hearing us through computer mediated technology. And so the thought must be that, well, if we had little avatars representing us, somehow it would become fake. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's sort of just another channel of communication which we could choose to add to this communication that we're engaged in right now. So all of the online stuff, it's as real as any interaction, right? You're still communicating with real people using real words and real language, and expressing real emotions and so forth. And yes, it's true. You are often using avatars, but we use avatars in everyday life. I mean, you and I and all your listeners dress in different ways to interact with different people, right? If you have to go to an important meeting, you dress up. If you're just going somewhere to watch TV with someone, you can schlub it, So, yeah, I think hopefully people are beginning to understand that this virtual / reality distinction has completely collapsed.
Mm-hmm. It seems to be nearing its tail end. We were on about these early forms of the internet, and you don't see much of this anymore. The early sort of MMOs, early Second Life, and Second Life is still fairly anarchistic. But I think sort of around 2005, maybe 2008. Strange, it was just after the market crash, actually. What's sort of been named by Nick Land, the philosopher, the Facebook slump, where all of a sudden it was almost like the Judge Dredd of the internet, where it was just 5 massive, social media corporations, and the internet suddenly turned into like a American or just a mall, So there was just these clear-cut sites, and nothing felt stumbled upon or like dirty or DIY or anarchistic like it used to. And this is getting sort of worse and worse, and we're heading into almost where like the internet is becoming synonymous with 20 companies, something like that: Amazon, Facebook, Instagram, etc., etc. What do you think it is, if you agree with this, what do you think it is that has changed the internet in this way? And do you think that we're actually now reaching the tail end of this and entering into like internet 3.0, where it's going to become free again because of cryptocurrency?
I ended up the Crypto Anarchy book with the piece by Hakim Bey on temporary autonomous zones. And part of the idea of that is that these temporary autonomous zones, when they emerge, are never permanent and they're always fleeting. And while cryptocurrency, or more generally encryption technology, might provide islands in the net for us, I tend to think that those always end up being temporary. Now, to the first part of your question about when Facebook and these giant social media companies came on, I mean, what did that do to the texture of life online? Yeah, I have that sense too, that it was a sort of a sad development. Now, the funny thing is that when I went into Second Life, I think it was about the same year that Facebook started, 2004, if I'm not mistaken, 2003, 2004. And it does feel as though Facebook kind of replaced what those virtual worlds were supposed to become. Interestingly, people talked about virtual worlds as being Internet 3.0, or in some cases, Internet 3.D. And people were saying things, well, like first there was the original internet, and then there was the social media internet, and now there was, as some people said, the experience internet, where we're just going in and share experiences. And that never happened, which is sad. And I think to some extent it's just because Facebook replaced that, because it gave everyone a very easy way of creating avatars, although the avatars are supposedly, faithful representations of what you are in real life. But, let's face it, those selfies that everyone takes are avatars, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they're not what you look like in real life. So I find the whole social media thing to be sad, because there was this glimmer of what online life could have been, and then there is what it became. And what it became is something sad and depressing. And what it looked like it was going to become is something really exciting and new and full of creative play and so forth. And there's really nothing new or creative. It's just a lot of disinformation flowing around, and a lot of emoting and anger and virtue signaling in today's internet.
So you don't see it with the increased uptake of cryptocurrencies and Ethereum and things along these lines. You don't see it moving back towards how it used to be, or do you even see that as a possibility?
It's possible. I mean, there are attempts to put there is a virtual world that's built on the blockchain right now, mm-hmm. but it is, in my opinion, horrifically bad. I mean, it's like everything looks the same in it. I mean, when you went into Second Life in 2004, 2005, it was complete anarchy, but it was like beautiful, because people were just building whatever was like their little ids were spinning out, man. And like you would just walk through the world and see all kinds of crazy stuff and see people doing all kinds of crazy things. And I did go into this blockchain-based virtual world, and it's just, to me, it was just sad and boring. So I don't doubt that something new will emerge, but I don't know exactly when or where or how that's going to emerge. But I don't see it yet.
Do you think that this you mentioned virtual signaling and this form of culture. So do you think that cyberspace has succumbed to Conquest's second law, that any organization not explicitly and constitutionally right-wing will sooner or later become left-wing? Do you think that it's, like other things, just flowed to the left, like cyberspace and the internet has succumbed to that law because it doesn't have some overarching organization which says that it has to be X or Y?
Well, that claim mystifies me, because I don't see things floating to the left. I certainly don't see cyberspace floating to the left. I mean, if you look at where the most anarchistic places, like 4chan and 8chan, if you look at where they went, I mean, I'm a little bit mystified by it, but they went complete right wing. I mean, they to some extent, they spawned a lot of the fascism and white supremacy stuff that we're seeing today. Now, why did that happen? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but surely that is the case. And so I don't see any inevitable drift to the left once we sort of loosen the rules. I can see it going in both directions. I can imagine a situation in which you have two different poles and it would move to a left-wing pole or to a right-wing pole, left to its own devices. But I don't see an inexorable drift to the left.
So do you think with these poles that they would be separate states, sort of like the internet is allowing us to have a form of political fragmentation, which allows everyone to have their own camps simultaneously? So like Robert Nozick's Meta Utopia, or if you're familiar with him, Curtis Yarvin's idea of patchwork. So this idea that coexisting patches or states. Do you think that the underlying infrastructure of cyberspace allows this, or is allowing it to come about?
It's probably stronger than allows it. I think if we had Frank Ramsey here, if we brought him back, he could probably construct a proof for us that this is an inevitable outcome. That you get in different little cyber states or cyber communities online, there is this effort to, either through virtual signaling or whatever, to be more and more pure, to be seen as more and more inside the group. And these groups evolve in a way that they expunge people that are not trustworthily, following the rules. So the right-wing groups become more right-wing, the left-wing groups become more left-wing, and any sort of group with Doctrine D becomes more intense about Doctrine D and what it means, right? And so you start developing tests in order to assure that you are a worthy member of this group. And people emerge within these groups to moderate that process. I mean, it's very interesting. I don't know that that's actually been studied. I know people have studied it informally, and I had a very good friend that wrote informally about this topic long ago, back in the days of electronic bulletin boards. And it was about how even in the days of electronic bulletin boards, there was this kind of weird gravitational pull to become ideologically pure, whatever the doctrine is, whatever the thing was about, whether it's your football team or whether it's a certain kind of music. The idea was just become more and more pure, and then things get more and more fragmented. And then the result is, yes, you do get a kind of patchwork network of cyberstates.
Do you think that will eventually, should we say, compute into the physical world? That these cyberstates that are being formed online will eventually, quite literally, become reality?
Well, it's happened. It's happening right now. I think it's interesting. We, earlier we talked about Hakim Bey and the temporary autonomous zone. Mm-hmm. And then just yesterday I saw that in Seattle, they had taken, have you seen this already? They took over the
Capitol Hill is now quite literally a temporary
autonomous zone. Yeah. So I was wondering if they had gotten that name from Hakim Bey, right? It's in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And you see this with definitely, it's not, these things are not contained online, right? So the boundary between our online life and our quote unquote real world life is very, very porous. So anytime you see this kind of balkanization online, you get the exact image of that balkanization in the real world. So you see this with white wing groups and left wing groups, and any movement that you see in a virtual world, you ultimately are going to see it in the real world as well. I mean, I assume that's why the FBI and the CIA were in Second Life back in the day, because they had a sense that this stuff was going to very quickly and very easily spill out into the real world.
Do you think that then there's always this notion of I don't know if you've read the book by Hirschman, Exit, Voice and Loyalty, which is largely in relation to corporations. So if someone has a if you took the temporary autonomous zone, for instance, loyalty would just say whatever happens in it, you're loyal to it. Voice would be, if you have a disagreement, you voice it. But exit is like, I never wanted this, I don't want this, so I'm leaving. Now, do you think that for anyone, let's say, who isn't a fan of the, however you want to articulate what the general Western political position is on, throughout the UK and throughout the US, sort of a pseudo-democratic liberalism. I don't know if you'd agree, but that's how I just briefly describe it. If you wanted to exit from that, do you see cyberspace as the sort of the jumping point, the starting point to say, you know what, I've had enough. I'm exiting.
Well, I don't believe you can exit into cyberspace. I think the exiting idea is interesting. And one of the things about cyberspace is that exiting is frictionless. That is very easy to exit. I mean, it's not completely frictionless. I mean, there is a certain cost to leaving Facebook, but it's not like the cost of having to move to another town or leaving a community, right? It's not like the cost that's incurred in trying to get a new job, right? Mm-hmm. So another theory would be that, people have learned that exiting is actually not so hard in cyberspace. And I think we are now seeing more and more exiting happening in the physical world, right? People have, in a way, not only have people learned how to be subversive online, but they've also learned how to exit online. And so they are withdrawing not only from virtual communities or withdrawing into certain bubbles online, but they're withdrawing into bubbles in the real world, quote unquote, real world as well. So I think a lot of the fragmentation that we're seeing now was practiced and simulated online, not in virtual worlds necessarily, but in places like Facebook. If I can cluster up with my right-wing friends on Facebook, why can't I do that in the physical world as well? And I can.
So the one big question here, which I feel like I've sort of got a strangely, should we say, synchronistic opportunity, because my master's was continental philosophy. So that was why I made the joke in the questions about how I wouldn't sit entirely with Foucault in that debate. So your lineage is Chomsky and analytic philosophy, I believe. So
yeah,
the sort of collective unconscious acceptance of cyberspace is something which is, it's everywhere. That's undeniable. At least in the West, I'm sure there's remote rural areas that don't have connection to it, but it's certainly it's altering us in a certain way. Now, do you think it's going to fundamentally alter what it is to be a human being?
I don't think so. I say with so much confidence. There's an argument to be made that it actually brings us back to being more human in a way, in the sense that if you thought that we were tribal and nomadic, you can find yourself living in a way that is tribal and nomadic online and developing cultural practices for a small group. And, maybe that's a more human state or a more human condition to be in than to be under the control of a nation state or the mores and attitudes of a nation state. I mean, I'm not even worried about the state so much as I'm worried about collective attitudes for groups of, hundreds of millions of people. So maybe cyberspace is not really undermining our humanity, but maybe it's giving us the opportunity to practice our humanity. Now, you can practice it well or you can practice it badly, right? And right now we're practicing it badly because things are not pretty online. And in the current state of things, life online consists of a lot of people denigrating each other, shaming each other, and not very much towards creative pursuits or to seek out people with similar creative pursuits. And that's sad, but that could be temporary. There's no reason to think it's inevitable.
That's fair. So it just sort of exacerbates the inherent nature of man that's already there.
Well, but exacerbate has a negative connotation. So I don't.
Echoes.
It certainly, yeah, right. But I think there's something to be said for the idea that these global systems of attitudes and mores are maybe not the ideal human condition. And maybe the ideal human condition is sort of more tribal, more nomadic. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so if that's right, then cyberspace can afford you the tools to not isolate yourself or not isolate yourself with a particular toxic political dogma, but to seek out people with similar creative ideas and similar creative projects, to explore things, to do creative things, and not just sit there and sit there on Facebook and republish, stuff that's coming out of Russia or the Ukraine or out of the Democratic Party or wherever it's coming out of lately.
Unless there's anything you'd like to add or any projects that you're now working on, I think that'd be a good place to finish up.
Well, I think for today, we should just keep focused on this project and leave it with this project. Mm-hmm. I do think that, if people haven't read Temporary Autonomous Zones by Hakim Bey, and it should probably be required reading for your podcast, yeah? Yeah. It's definitely take a look at that because that's super fascinating. If you're interested in reading about like an analytic philosopher who is one of the most interesting people of the early 20th century, find that book by Frank Plumpton Ramsey. And that's all I've got.
Okay. Thanks, Peter.
All right. Bye.